Okay, so here I'm here with Peter again. We're setting up Unit 4, the final unit of the American Revolution course, as we've been working our way through the different ones. Wanted to set up a little bit, just to begin with, before we get into the essay questions, on the Bill of Rights and its significance, especially as this year was actually one of the essay questions, and the Declaration of Independence, because that can come up as well. So I've got the slide for the Bill of Rights in front of us. I just want to make points that the Bill of Rights, when we come to the ratification of the Constitution and how fundamental it was, I think it was really, really important, Madison's Bill of Rights, in terms of getting the ratification of the Constitution. And I think the key is with the Bill of Rights that the amendments are all basically showing how significant the different factors were in the build up to the revolution. And therefore also like really emphasizing which ones of the acts were significant for them. So if we look at the First Amendment, obviously prohibited Congress from establishing an official religion or interfering with freedom of speech, press, or peaceful assembly. Now, I think the origins of this one you can see from, again, that fear of Catholicism in Quebec and that idea of freedom of religion, because there was no one religion dominating any of the colonies. There was no state official religion in the United States. I mean, I was reading a book called Revolutions, I'm going to put in next year for the course as well, that was talking about how American religious fervor was stronger because it was a marketplace of religion. Religions actually had to compete with each other because there was no state-sponsored religion. And that ended up causing a lot more pressure to evolve and allowed the country to remain more religious. Also, the idea of freedom of speech, press, and peaceful assembly, I think that's down to the idea that the British, towards the end, were trying to limit what the Americans could and couldn't write to do with their rights in terms of independence. You have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, just a quick point, which is that there wasn't a unanimous agreement that there should be a Bill of Rights, correct?
Yeah, no, I think some of the ones who wanted a stronger federal centralized government didn't want.
So Hamilton objected. He thought that what was in what the amendments were in fact implicit, right, in the Constitution.
Yeah,
I'm just going from memory here.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think also it was the idea. The interesting one was it was Madison that passed it, because he was obviously a Federalist. Initially wrote the Federalist Papers with John Jay and Alexander Hamilton, and argued for a stronger centralized government. But then he realized that perhaps they were creating something too strong. And in order to balance, this is where I think he made his move ideologically across the Jeffersonian side, the Republican side, where he was like, actually, we need to make sure. A lot of people were afraid that they were creating a new king in the role of the president, and they were creating a new tyrannical government. And they were like, well, what I think the Bill of Rights was saying, like, well, what things did the British, we didn't, I think they were saying we didn't have a problem with the king in general, but what things did the king do in those last years? The king, it's still associated with the king rather than Parliament, but Parliament, king, whatever, what things did they do in those last years that was considered tyrannical? And can we make a Bill of Rights to limit the government that they cannot do any of these things? You know what I mean? And I think that's fundamental to show. I mean, in one way, it shows the ideological element to the revolution is real, as opposed to just the economic self-interest, because this Bill of Rights is clearly targeting rights that they felt threatened by during that period.
Right.
And I think that's why they had to bring it in.
Or could you put it, I mean, could you put it in another way that it was important to have somewhat of a rhetorical position on this? I mean, to make it, in other ways, to make a convincing case.
Yeah.
And that convincing case doesn't necessarily correspond exactly to reality, right? It corresponds to people's fears and hopes at that time. Like these old Whigs were always scared of or thought some kind of king-like figure, right?
Mm-hmm.
But were those fears, are they kind of real? At that point, that's what I tend to think that they were maybe somewhat exaggerated, but that in order for this to get done, and it's a really tricky thing to get first of all to get the Constitution ratified. That's a massive challenge.
We'll deal with that later.
And so you need to make a pretty good case for it.
Yes.
And I think some features of it might be exaggerated and others not.
if you're talking about how it's exaggerated against the reality of what they faced in the build up to the war, maybe. But I'm
Yeah,
thinking, would you concede that these powers that they were rebelling against were possible theoretically under the British Constitution and under the new Constitution? The president could have done these things, and the king.
yeah,
We'll use king, but we mean parliament, but they associate
yeah.
with the king. The king
Well,
could,
yeah. Sorry.
I think the king could have done these things and did. I mean, some of these things were real. They did champion Catholicism in Quebec. They were worried about that. I think okay, maybe this one, the First Amendment was more theoretical, but some of the others are definitely based on real things that
Well,
happened.
England has a national church, right?
Yes.
So,
But it was a compromise between Protestantism and Catholicism because Elizabeth I had to balance both sides. So it's always been Anglicanism has been fairly loose. And I think there was religious tolerance in England, except if you were Catholic, no?
I
Although
don't know, James. I think there was a lot of conflict in England. I think the established church in England, really, was at odds with the kind of the Puritans or the more the Protestant factions on the one hand, and then the Catholics on the other, to such an extent, indeed, that I think there were points when the Catholics and the Protestants ganged up on the Anglicans. They formed a kind of funny alliance. But be that's something else. We're getting a bit off
was
topic.
it still the case by this point, though, by like the 17?
No, I don't think so.
I think that's more an earlier worry that they'd carried forward, which a lot of these are earlier worries they carried through. And
Indeed.
I know that Oxford and Cambridge, you couldn't go unless you were Protestant. I think it had to be Anglican, but you had to be Protestant. You couldn't.
You had to be an Anglican. You couldn't. Yeah. I think it was only in the 19th century when Catholics could begin to go to.
Yeah, UCL was founded as the first UCL was the first university that allowed non-Protestants to go to university, and then that's why King's was set up to combat it. Anyway, we're going a bit off topic.
We are getting off topic. We're getting sucked into the vortex of English history. So let's keep going. So that's the First Amendment.
Unit 4 is going to suck us into lots of different places because it is like most of my students struggle with Unit 4. They find it difficult, and because it's a lot of ideas going on. You really have to understand your stuff. I think.
Yeah, it's massive. It's massive.
Yeah, and it's so much theory as well. It's not just the practical side. The Second Amendment then required each state to maintain a militia and affirm the right of all citizens to bear arms.
Oh, we love the Second Amendment, don't we? This is something that echoes through history.
Yeah. And I think that's clear that it's the idea is that the militia were the only reason they managed to survive the war was through the militia. And it's the idea of having an army to oppose an armed federal tyranny was the idea behind the Second Amendment. I think that's a real threat and something that they definitely used in place. So the idea of maintaining this militia was to maintain a civilian military force against a federal /king/parliament military force.
But the civilian military force isn't really organized, is it? Because in the kind of current interpretation of the Second Amendment, it's just every citizen.
Yes.
But not part of a citizen militia.
No, I think it should. I mean, I think the founding fathers clearly meant to have a citizen militia, not like completely anarchic use of guns. But obviously it's been co-opted by the NRA and other organizations into what they want it to be. But I think at that time, you can definitely see the importance of this, to feel like citizens can have that right to arm themselves, because they couldn't have arms. They couldn't run a militia. If without the militias, they wouldn't have won the war of independence.
Absolutely.
And so I think that's vitally important. You can see where that comes from again as well. So, and it's like talking about the kind of firearms, if you're thinking in that time period, people are armed with muskets. So you could defend yourself as a militia against the army. An ordinary civilian wouldn't have been massively less armed than a professional soldier, just less well-trained. But obviously in the modern times, like some numpty with a rifle in his backyard, it's not going to be up for much against the SAS.
Yeah, I still think it matters. And I think it's interesting that, the Second Amendment and even, contemporary debates about the Second Amendment, we are actually it's not just about guns.
Yeah.
It's about government. It's about one's attitude to government.
Yeah.
And in some ways, and what's really weird in the US is a weird place in many ways, but
definitely.
But the pro gun movement does in some ways seem like a really weird anachronism. These are like kind of wigs,
that
are still are scared of, some kind of, James II or something, or some,
Yeah.
American government going bananas.
Yeah.
I think that's quite interesting.
Yeah. For sure, I think, and it's obviously that mentality that government is a dangerous threat, and therefore you need to protect yourself. So it's the idea of the Bill of Rights is the idea of protecting citizens. It's not designed; it's designed to allow citizens to protect themselves from the government.
Yeah, that's right, from the government.
Yeah.
And but to your knowledge, James, was there really any controversy about the Second Amendment
No, I don't think so.
Prior to the sort of mid to late 20th century, or is it sort of fairly benign?
I don't think that, not to my knowledge, because it's like it was a frontier society, wasn't it? So you had to be armed. I mean, you're getting attacked by Native Americans on the frontier. You've got the Wild West shooting at each other. You've got people just like America's always been a violent place.
Well, but I think lots of people had guns just generally anyway. I mean, in the 19th century, for sure.
In America.
And even in the early 20th century. And I think that's probably true to some extent, even in Britain, isn't it? I think it definitely.
Yeah, but I think there would have been they would have had like hunting rifles for their fox hunts and that was stuff. I don't think they would have. I don't think the average citizen in London would have been armed because there just wasn't the threat. There wasn't the violence and the threat in the same way that there was in America. Because America was a new country; it was growing, it was expanding, it was constantly at war. Constantly.
I don't know, James. Maybe it would have been good if in 1941, or so 1940. It may have been the Britons may have felt a little bit better if everyone was armed. I don't know.
I don't know. We don't even arm our police like the New Zealand.
I know, that's right.
But I think
I
think it's because also like England hasn't been invaded for nearly 1,000 years. So what's the need for a civilian defense force against what?
Well, it almost got invaded. It was almost going to be invaded in 1940. But it would 1940. But
it would never have been the army that was
1941.
The army wouldn't have been the deciding factor. It would have been the Air Force and the Navy always for the British. I mean, army-wise, we were pretty rubbish. So I don't think there was too much controversy. I think again, it was the idea that if citizens felt they could arm themselves, they felt they could have their own religion, they could say what they wanted, they feel free. You know what I mean? I think maybe it's an illusion of freedom, but it's a feeling of freedom, I think. And that's the key thing for the Americans, to feel free, even if to feel like their government can't take these rights from them. I think if they felt like if they've got all these, they're all right. The Third Amendment, I think, is quite obvious. Prohibited quartering of troops on civilians. That's obviously linked to the two quartering acts that were passed under the Intolerable Acts and the other stuff. So it was a clear link to the Intolerable Acts, a clear link to the Townsend duties when they brought in quartering acts. And I think
that's a clever act, isn't it? It's a clever act because the the irony is, of course, that the executive they set up in the Constitutional Convention in some ways has more authority than the king.
Yes.
In Britain. And so rhetorically, it's important to make sure that, cut as many parallels as possible with British government.
Yeah.
One way of doing that would be showing very explicitly that quartering of troops is prohibited.
Yeah, things that it was basically like these are all the things they went to arms over and all the things they were worried about. And these are the things they explicitly marked as tyranny and the reasons for their revolution. So, you can't then go and do them yourselves, especially as we'll look at some of the things they just did exactly the same as the British with the first problems in the early republic. So at least they managed to eliminate. They probably were like, well, hang on a minute, you're doing exactly the same, stopping us from going westward, basically raising taxes, etc. But they were like, yeah, but at least we're not doing this, the tyrannical part, the true tyrannical part. This is our Bill of Rights for you. Number 4, prohibited unreasonable searches and seizure of property. I think that's obvious, the idea of the right of property, which is, I assume, to do with the fact that their boats were being taken and seized during the war and the civilian merchandising was being seized. But it's quite ironic that kind of, after the Boston Tea Party, that one they weren't really following seizure of property and unreasonable searches themselves. But you can see again why this is there. It's clearly to stop the government from confiscating mercantile goods, I think.
I wonder how well that holds up now. I mean, I think of going through airport security.
Yes. Yeah. Well, is that unreasonable?
You could make a constitutional argument that's that you can't just search people, everybody.
Can you not? Because it says unreasonable searches, and I think
it does. That's right. That's right. That's a loophole, isn't it? So
searching people on a plane, I think, is quite reasonable.
What's that?
I think it's more, that's a public place. You choose to fly. You know what I mean? So I suppose that's the difference. Whereas they can't just come in your house and take stuff. I suppose it's separating out public.
I know you could, yeah, you could think of what what they were doing in New York City in the 90s, the
Yeah,
what do they call it? The shakedowns,
stop and search.
stop and search,
Yeah,
Mayor
yeah,
Giuliani.
yeah. I think these are quite vague. That's the key. That's why they've led
Yes, of
to
course, that's right.
lots of court cases and lots of like fighting over.
Well, yeah, that's
And
right. That's
when we
right.
get into the 20th century course, 19th, 20th century course, we'll be dealing with a lot of this. And then fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth are kind of linked, I think, and it shows how much that trial by jury, moving murder trials to Britain, moving like court cases up to the Vice Admiralty Court in Halifax, Nova Scotia, was a problem for them, and in Quebec, because in Quebec again, if you look at this, a lot of these things were done in Quebec. They established the official religion of Catholicism, so the Quebec Act was there. They removed like the right to gather in assembly because they increased the governor's powers. So that was a problem. Then this one, no one has to be compelled to bear witness against themselves, be deprived of livelihood, property without due process of law, the right to be tried by an impartial jury in public, which is why I think they had problems with the Intolerable Acts and with the Quebec Act, both of them putting that under security. Right to a jury trial in civil disputes involving over $20.
Is that true still?
I imagine the fee must be
Adjusting for inflation
that
or
must
not?
increase with inflation.
What would $20 be?
I mean, you're not even going to take someone to court for $20 nowadays. It probably costs you more for the
Well,
stuff.
that's Judge Judy. That's the kind of quantities of things that fighting over in Judge Judy.
And no excessive bail or cruel.
Just quickly.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, just quickly. The due process of law is very important.
Yeah, it's the British tradition.
Yeah, one of the most important amendments, I think. Yeah.
I think all of them, no excessive bail or cruel unusual punishments and no torture either. But I think 5, 6, 7, and 8 are clearly linked to the Magna Carta trial of jury, linking back all the way through British history to the idea that and I think this is really clear. Those 4 amendments really show how much that moving trials to Vice Admiralty Court really annoyed them, and how the suspension of like trial by jury in Quebec, or like continuation of the French idea of no trial by jury, which is what they were really worried would come in. And I think you can see in these amendments that fear of Frenchification, like the idea again of, well, if we hadn't, like, if this president is all powerful and could do whatever they want, because they didn't know exactly, no one had done this before, no one knew what now you thought, well, you know what the president's rights are, but even now they just had the court case saying the presidents can commit whatever crimes they want basically while doing their normal duty. So like the arguments over how powerful the president is without the Bill of Rights, that would be quite a scary civil Supreme Court judgment that was just passed down.
Oh, I don't think so, James. I disagree with you.
I don't know. Like it's like it can.
No. But no. Well, we don't need to argue about contemporary American politics.
But it's theory, isn't it? It's theory, not practice of what would happen, but theoretically what the rights are, and that's the key. I think they wanted to.
Yeah.
They wanted to bind in Goliath. They wanted to tie up the government so they couldn't do anything. The idea is like anticipate what they could do and get rid of it, rather than dealing with what is happening. Because if you're dealing with what is happening, so as they realized under the Quebec Act and Intolerable Acts, it's already too late. You've got to bind this in beforehand so that it doesn't happen. Right. And then at least you have justification. If they break any of the other amendments, they have the justification of Amendment 2, Second Amendment, to get up in arms and do it. The 9 made it clear that not all rights were necessarily defined in the Constitution. That's an awful amendment, because that means that I'm sure opened up a can of worms of anything that can go outside would be a nightmare. Because it's like obviously new rights could then come in, but that's led to like loads of fights down the centuries. And made it clear that states retain any rights that were not specifically transferred to the federal government. And that is fundamentally the 10th Amendment is a nightmare for our other course in civil rights that we'll deal with later.
Slavery, yeah.
States' rights versus federal. The 10th and the 9th opened up a whole. I think the 8th were clear responses to the British government. The 9th and 10th opened up a whole can of worms for further down the road.
Right.
Any comments you want to make on these ones? I think they're directly linked to the Intolerable Acts and Quebec Act and all the acts that came in. I think they're literally saying this is what the British did. We'll guarantee you we won't do it.
That's right. As they're setting up a government that looks eerily like British government,
but stronger, because it's actually an older version, isn't it? Because they've given the executive power back.
Yes.
Because the president is stronger than the king.
I don't think. It is and it isn't. I mean, it is and it isn't.
In what ways do you think it is, and what ways do you think it isn't?
Well, I mean, I think in Britain, the case the separation of powers that happened in Britain occurred as a result of historical events.
Yeah.
Essentially, it wasn't some kind of theoretical plan that they'd enacted. It was a set of conflicts that had a set of results, right?
Hmm.
Conflicts between Parliament and the King, for example. Whereas I think in this case, these what we might say these American elites are very well read in Montesquieu and Locke and other philosophers, and they're putting together a scheme. Montesquieu, for example, he admired England a lot, and a lot of his writing is related to what Montesquieu observed in the British Constitution. So, but
Hamilton
on
had
the
good
other
as
hand,
well.
what's very remarkable about this is that these people like Madison, Jefferson, these wealthy, educated Americans are really kind of establishing a project, right? A kind of theoretical project. It's never really been done.
Yeah.
With some aspects that resemble British government and others that don't.
Whereas Hamilton wanted to set up basically an elite, an American elite, to run the country in a British way with the aristocracy in the same way that Britain had, as a protector of the rights of the privileged over those that had less.
Right.
Whereas Jefferson and Madison obviously championed a more populist democracy. And
one obvious difference, one massive difference between the American Constitution and Britain is obviously states' rights, right?
Yeah.
And that's crucial, that's fundamental. It's part of the separation of powers too. So it's not just that you divide powers in a state government and in the federal government. You also have state and federal government to some extent offsetting each other.
Yeah.
Balancing each other out. That element is, I think, quite new.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I think the difference is most governments. So the British government, I think, was set up to get things done. That's where the Prime Minister selects their executive from the Parliament. It's the major party that's in power. So there's really not many things to stop a Prime Minister putting through their agenda. So stuff can get done. I think the Americans fundamentally don't like government, or didn't like government, and the whole setting up the American system was set up for nothing to change and nothing to happen. That was the idea behind it was not to get stuff done. It was to stop the executive getting stuff done. The idea being that something could only change if the whole country was behind it.
Yeah, I think that's true to some extent. Obviously, the framers, for example, thought that it was important for the executive to have really a lot of flexibility, a lot of power in foreign relations.
Yeah.
So, I mean, with some exceptions. For example, obviously the president can't declare war. Congress has to declare war.
Oh, now they can, though, no? Under the imperial presidency as Nixon, they can declare war for 30 days.
Yeah, that's right.
30
So
days
don't
or
look at
60
modern.
days
Don't look
until
at
they
modern.
have to get Congress's approval, so they can have mini wars.
But this is we're talking in the beginning.
Yeah.
So
the states gave a shit about foreign policy, to be honest, in the beginning. So I think they were like, yeah, let the president deal with that. The Americans even now don't really care about foreign policy.
Oh, James, come on. I'm not sure. I think
the American electorate, I think they vote on domestic issues. I don't think they care.
Yeah.
American isolationism runs quite strongly in American. It's absolutely weird. It's an isolationist empire. Which is as in one of the many contradictions of the Americans.
I think it's one aspect of their politics is isolationism, which has been stronger and weaker depending on the period. But I do think, obviously, American hegemony is founded on the aftermath of the Second World War. But this is again, we're getting. I think we're getting sidetracked.
I mean, we'll deal with this when we get into actual questions, because we're going to one of the things: the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. how fundamentally, how important was the Declaration of Independence? Do you think it's more or less important than the Bill of Rights?
Oh, important to who at the time?
Yeah, at the time. Because I think now the legacy is a little bit different for both of these documents.
Hmm. I don't know. I mean, I think that that people are still able to quote the beginning, the preamble of the Declaration of Independence. Most people ignore all of the complaints against the king and all that stuff, though, right?
Yeah.
It's the first couple of paragraphs in the Declaration that
but the idea that all men are created equal, but the idea that that's implicitly only really related to white men is fundamentally problematic, because you have a document that is universal but isn't really articulating universal rights, but that then all of these other groups
yeah.
use to get their rights.
But what happens if you consider it as an aspiration and not a statement of fact?
Yeah, go on then. Do you want to elaborate?
Well, this becomes apparent in the slavery debates later on. Lincoln refers to the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, so do the women's rights groups, so does the NAACP.
Yeah,
so there's like all I think
right.
like everyone comes back and goes, well, hang on a minute, you've got this written in this document. Do you think that was their intention? Jefferson was anti-slavery-ish, like at least he recognized it was an evil. He just knew it was important for the Southern economy.
But the meaning of it, the plain meaning of it, seems to me men were created equal.
Yeah,
and in a certain sense, that's, I mean, if we're babies, or if we're essentially in our sense of being human beings with souls.
Yeah,
that's true. It's debatable, right, what that means.
Did the white Southerners
vague.
consider an African American baby to be similar as human as a white baby? I'm not sure they did.
I think it depends, James. I think it depends. I think there were some that didn't. I think there were some that did.
Well, I think that it apparently it got worse leading up to the Civil War. Like the real distinction after there were a few slave revolts in the early 1800s, and that
absolutely
was such a fear factor in the South that they had to create their ideology.
Yes. It got more extreme. It was actually fairly moderate in the 18th century. It became much more extreme in the 19th.
Yeah, because the anti-slavery movement created a backlash of like a stronger enforced slavery movement. It's a bit like the modern times, where the right in America and the left in America are reinforcing each other to go more and more extreme. You know what I mean? It's like, because they're both a backlash against each other, and therefore it's pulling further and further to a more extremist position.
Yeah, I think that's true.
America's always had these reactionary divisions, and we'll get onto that in Unit 4's got a lot of meat when we can talk about this one. But those two documents, I think, are quite important because they can sometimes get essays on the significance of the Bill of Rights.
So what do you think? You think the Bill of Rights? Yeah,
I think without the Bill of Rights, there would be no America. I don't think they'd have got it ratified without the Bill of Rights, or at least not without a further mini civil war of like crushing the Jeffersonian wing of things. I think they would have had a struggle to get it through. Whereas I think the Declaration of Independence is the real catalyst and engine room for most. But I think both of those documents fundamentally have been morphed into something much more powerful than they were anticipated at the beginning. You know
absolutely.
They've both taken on mythical clarion call positions because persecuted groups like women, like African Americans, like Native Americans have used these documents to get themselves into a better position today than they were at the founding of the Republic.
Yes.
So they've taken on, and I agree with your point. I'm not sure that when they wrote them, Madison and Jefferson, that they intended them to be aspirational documents, but I certainly think people have taken them on in that way.
Yes, that's right. They have to be reinterpreted. But it's interesting. I mean, I like to compare the Declaration of Independence to, the Declaration of the Rights of Man.
Yeah.
In the French Revolution, I think the Declaration of the Rights of Man is really a manifesto.
Yeah.
And I think people at the time took a lot more notice of the French of the Déclaration.
Perhaps because the
I
French
don't. I'm
knew
not.
they were going to form a new government, whereas the Americans didn't plan on doing that. When the Declaration of Independence was made, they still didn't plan on having a government, and the Bill of Rights was a cobbled together piece of
Yeah,
document to get
that's right.
through. So I don't think either
That's
of them
right.
were designed with
That's
a
right.
particular motive, other than the
You know. You know.
Americans very much do stuff to get through that moment in time as opposed to a long-term plan.
Right. Right. That's right.
All right. Should we move on? Should we start with the essays? We can finish this one up and then.
Let's go.